Alrighty, welcome back everyone. We just talked about some of the details from the SEC spring meetings this past week. Definitely a lot of stuff around conference realignment, around Florida State and Clemson, and a little bit of Utah in there as well. So definitely a lot of stuff to unpack there, but I do want to get to a question that has kind of been bouncing around the college football world the last couple of really years when we've heard about this 12-team playoff. What is good enough to make the playoff in 2024 in particular, but beyond in the 12-team playoff? I think when you look at some of the schedules that have kind of been unpacked, especially over the last, I feel like 5 years has really been the big time moniker. You've seen a lot of big time matchups pop into play. You've seen Texas, Michigan. You've seen Georgia, Clemson come into play. A&M's playing Notre Dame. A ton of big time games have been scheduled by these big time programs, and I think it's somewhat of a reaction to what they think is going to come from this new playoff that is definitely going to be a big time question mark, I suppose, in the future of college football. I think when you look at these out of conference schedules, we talked about it yesterday with USC and LSU. It is vital that these games are a part of the early parts of these seasons. We absolutely need these teams on full display, playing some of the better teams in the country. Alabama playing Wisconsin is still a very fun game. A&M playing Notre Dame. We have Georgia playing Clemson. We have Texas playing Michigan. All of these games are hugely important to what college football is. It gets everyone excited for the season, gets everyone involved, gets everyone really, really pumped up, and it's something that I think all of us are very, very excited for when the season does come around. So when you add, those big time opponents, you definitely do open a little bit of a door for yourself, whether it's to be a 9-3 team that ends up getting into the playoff where you can point to a Michigan game, let's say for Texas, and say we went out of our way to play a big time team. We shouldn't necessarily be punished as aggressively for that as someone who maybe is 11-1 but didn't necessarily play that aggressive of a schedule. So it's going to be a huge question mark, right? There's going to be so many things to kind of factor into that. Chris Del Conte talked about this at length when he was talking about Texas scheduling. He said they did this on purpose. They absolutely wanted more of those marquee games on the early parts of the season because it gives you a little bit more leeway one way or the other. Let's say Texas beats Michigan and they can use that as kind of a moniker where you can lose two games in the SEC and still point back to that as a really good win, the same way they did with Alabama a year ago. So I think this is something that is going to be fascinating to watch. Obviously, as we all know, the 5 top conference champions, they're in. So that's not necessarily a question. But 7 at-large teams is a lot. There's no two ways about that. There is a ton of at-large teams to play around with here. And the question is, where do they come from? I think we all can agree the vast majority will come from the Big Ten and the SEC in one form or another. But the reality is you got to include some other people, but you have to figure out how to include them. So I think one of the big questions that we'll likely see throughout this year is, say there's a Big 12 team. Let's say Iowa State. They're just a random team. But let's say Iowa State ends up going 11-1, but loses in the Big 12 championship. So they're not automatically in. They're 11-2. They're a really good team. They've done really good things and won a lot of their games. But then you also have a Texas or an Ole Miss might be a good example here. That's 9-3 in the SEC. Now, obviously, Iowa State has 2 more wins. They have 1 less loss. They, got to their conference championship. But also, I think we can all say with confidence that Ole Miss is playing a much tougher schedule than Iowa State is. So you got to measure those two. You have to absolutely put those two next to each other and figure out which one is more important to you. Frankly, to me, I'm not a fan of auto bids. I think if the goal is to get a national title, if the goal is to get a national champ, it should always be the goal to put the best teams in that field. Now, I know there is a little bit of precarious situation that has happened in the past with the 4-team playoff, but honestly, I think it could be even more precarious as we go forward into this 12 team because this is going to happen. I can't necessarily, I know for a fact, in fact, the Florida State situation will never happen again. We're not going to have an undefeated team that gets left out of the playoff in favor of a one-loss team. That's just not going to happen because there's not going to be 13 undefeated teams in a season. But the reality is there are going to be teams that have more losses or have a worse record that find their way into the playoff. And frankly, I think it's a good thing. I think it's crazy to think, frankly, that we shouldn't be doing this. We have to find a way, especially in this 12-team playoff, to measure these schedules effectively. And I understand that will hurt some of the Big 12 and ACC teams in these arguments, but the reality is you're trying to find a national title. You're not necessarily trying to make sure everyone's included, and you've already done that by adding an auto bid for those leagues. So I don't necessarily worry about the at-large bids for those two for those two conferences and the other conferences that are a little bit below, because the reality is the best team should be playing at the end of the year for the biggest trophy. That's just the reality of the situation. I don't think there should be much of a pushback on that. I understand there are ACC fans, there are Big 12 fans that want their team to have a shot if they lose a couple of games, if they stumble a little bit. But the reality is, when you stumble a little bit in the Big 12, it could be that you would have stumbled a lot in the SEC or the Big 10. So it's kind of one of those precarious situations. It's a question that is really going to be impossible to answer until you get to the end of the year, until you figure out what's going on with the college football playoff and with this season coming up. So it's going to be fascinating to watch. I think the SEC is kind of the one that probably poses the biggest threat here, because when you look at some of those big-time SEC schedules, they are terrifying. I could easily make the argument that a Florida team could go 9-3 and be comfortably a number 12 or top 12 team in the country. So there is definitely going to be a conversation here. There's definitely going to be a lot going into this. Now, one of the big things that someone over at CBS, I believe Shahan Jayaraja, broke down was what this hypothetical would look like in the past. So from 1998, let's say we had a 12-team playoff. There would be 28 teams with 3 losses or more that would have made the playoff in that 12 teams. So definitely a very interesting thing. As you can see, a lot from the SEC, a lot from the Big 12, which obviously, would include some teams that were in the past, like Texas, like Oklahoma. So that's a little bit of a different situation, but still, it definitely gives you an idea of where these would come from. Big 10 with 7, I think that might take a little bit of a boost and take away from some of what maybe the Pac-12 had during that time, and then the ACC with 4. So it gives you an idea that this isn't far-fetched necessarily. A 9-3 team getting in is absolutely something that could happen, and it's something that a lot of people at the SEC meetings were talking about, because you're going to play a tougher schedule. You're going to play games that every single week you have to show up and be ready to go, because you're going to get hit in the mouth a couple of times. So it's one of those things that I think when we look at the future of the 12-team playoff, it really rides on the shoulders of the selection committee. I think when you look at the selection committee, there is so much pressure on them to make sure that they get the right teams in, that they get the teams that absolutely deserve to be in, because when we look at this kind of era of college football, there is going to be a lot of variability. There's going to be a lot of question mark. There's going to be some upsets in some of these playoff games. But the reality is you have to put yourself in a position where at the end of the year we can look at the champion and say that is one of, if not the best team in the country. It's what we were able to do with most of the playoffs in every playoff in the past, if I'm the one voting, frankly. But I think when we look at it, it's going to get more precarious, and it's going to get tougher to measure these guys next to each other. I frankly think we should be using some type of power rating system to figure out who should be in and who shouldn't. But that's, above my pay grade, I suppose. I think there's going to be a lot of fascinating things to happen from this. Let's say that a team that gets to their conference championship but doesn't play as tough of a schedule is rewarded for that. Let's just say a 11-2 Arizona beats out a 9-3 Ole Miss to get into the playoff. Those teams like Ole Miss, like Alabama, like Texas, like Michigan, Ohio State, Georgia, whoever you want to say, they're going to stop scheduling those big out-of-conference games. And they should, if I'm being totally honest. If the goal is to get into the playoff, if the goal is to put yourself in a position to get in the playoff, and you're not getting rewarded for scheduling those out-of-conference games that are going to be really tough, why would you do it? Why would you put yourself in that position to lose a game before you even get into your conference schedule, especially if you're a Big 12 or an SEC team where you're going to do plenty of big-time wins in your SEC or in your Big 10 schedule. So it's going to be fascinating to watch this unfold. I think when we look at the playoff this upcoming year, there are tons of teams that could find their way in. Obviously, tons of Group of 5 teams, but in the Big 12, I can think of 4 or 5 teams that I think could make a run and get a auto or at large bid. I think the ACC has 4 or 5 teams that could win the ACC or possibly get an at large bid, depending on how the cookie crumbles, as it were. But I do think there needs to be a real conversation in those rooms about what does an SEC schedule look like compared to an ACC, and how do we contextualize that? Because as we know, there are tougher schedules in those two conferences. That's just the way it is. They're going to play teams that are going to be higher rated most of the time when you go through those schedules. Now, that's not to say if you do go 11-1 in the Big 12 or the ACC, you shouldn't have a shot to get in, or you shouldn't get in necessarily, but you have to be able to measure these things accurately, and you have to be able to take out the part where, not necessarily take out the 3 losses and take out the 1 loss, but just look at it as holistically as possible and say this is a 9-3 season, but they played the number 4, 7, and 12 team in the country, whereas you have an 11-1 season where you played 2 ranked teams and they were number 18 and number 24. So there needs to be that conversation. There needs to be a push to get the best teams in, the teams that absolutely deserve to be in, the teams that have put themselves in the best position to be in, and it doesn't necessarily have to be completely tied to record, as it kind of has been in the past. So this is going to be a fascinating thing to watch. I think it's one of those things that a lot of things are going to be decided about the future of college football and in terms of scheduling this year, because if you reward those teams for scheduling those out-of-conference games, I think more people will do it. If you dock them essentially for scheduling those games and possibly losing them, you're going to see more of what we saw yesterday with USC and LSU. I think there is a chance that some of these teams just decide, what's the point of us playing each other? If, let's just say, hypothetically, Texas goes 9-3, and one of those losses to Michigan, and they don't get in, and there's some controversy around that. Well, they play Ohio State next year, and why would you play Ohio State if that's going to put you in danger of not making the playoff again? So it's going to be fascinating to watch this unfold. I think it's one of those things where the College Football Playoff Committee has a lot of power in their hands about what the future of college football is going to look like from a scheduling perspective. So it'll be interesting to watch, that's for sure. But we're going to take our second break here, and when we come back, we're going to talk about sponsorships possibly coming to college football on the field, on jerseys. Definitely a double-edged sword here, so I'll break that down right after this, so stick with us.